Okay, thanks, Kevin. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're tuning in from. Welcome to this public event on Gulf-Israel relations, and it's hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Clemens Che, and I will act as moderator for this event that will be recorded. The cultivation of bilateral ties between the Gulf states and Israel, with the exception of Kuwait, which we will talk about later, has been an open secret. And to the extent that one Middle East commentator, Ian Black, calls these relations just below the surface. He alludes to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks on September 2017, when he told Israeli diplomats at the Foreign Ministry, and I quote, "What is happening in practice with Arab states has never happened in our history, even when we signed peace agreements. And in practice, cooperation in different ways and at different levels isn't necessarily visible above the surface, but what is below the surface is far greater than at any period in Israel's victory. It is a huge change," unquote. So alongside cooperative initiatives are high-profile state visits, including Netanyahu's visit to Oman in October 2018 for talks with Sultan Qaboos, the late Sultan Qaboos, accompanied by the head of the Mossad. So more recently, of course, the UAE became the first Gulf state and the third Arab state behind Egypt and Jordan to recognize and fully normalize relations with Israel. The UAE-Israel deal, also known as the Abraham Accord, makes today's discussion more timely than ever. Not only because it marks the establishment of overt diplomatic relations, but also because of the implications the deal has for the Gulf, Arab public opinion in general, and the remaining solutions for the Palestinians, among others. So today, we are delighted to have with us a stellar list of speakers who are joining us. Ghabra, he's joining us from Washington, D.C. He's a professor of political science at Kuwait University and the founding president of Jusur Arabiya, which focuses on youth leadership programs and strategic planning. He is the former founding president of the American University of Kuwait. He also directed the Kuwait Information Office in Washington, D.C. and the Center of Strategic Studies at Kuwait University. Dr. Ghabra earned his BA from Georgetown, his MA from Purdue University, and his PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin in 1987. He is the author of 5 books and numerous studies. And our fourth speaker is Rabbi David Rosen. Pleased to have you on board. He is the International Director of Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Committee. He is concurrently a member of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel's Committee for Interreligious Dialogue and serves also on the Council of the Religious Institutions of the Holy Land. He holds positions in various organizations, including as the International President of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, Honorary President of the International Council of Christians and Jews, and as the only Jewish member of the Board of Directors of the King Abdullah International Center for Interreligious and Intercultural Dialogue, established in 2012 by the King of Saudi Arabia. Thank you. Okay, with that, we would like to invite comments from our 3 panelists. Should we start with Dr. Shafeeq? I think you're muted. Okay.
So I have about 10 minutes. You will remind me at the time. I mean, this agreement took the region by surprise. I would not look at it as a positive agreement or a positive development. Given the state of the region, too many conflicts, Iran, Turkey, civil wars. The UAE is involved in so many different complicated issues and conflicts in the region. the Gulf crisis, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar. So Israel is coming on a already very heated situation that will now become more heated, given that there is a Turkish base in Qatar. There are American bases in the region. The US seems to be on the way out. So does that mean Israel is on the way in? And yet Israel has a major, bigger problem. I would have wished that Israel would have solved its problem, the main problem with the Palestinian people, before seeking to go in that direction. Because these relations could survive for a while, but they could be short-lived. They could survive with high hopes, but then they could dwindle slowly over time, given the type of changes and developments that we are all seeing in the region. So it's a complicated situation. This agreement didn't have any popular support. You will see a lot of support on Twitter, motivated by certain ministries of interior and Ministry of Information, trolls, different types. It could be a few rooms that is managing hundreds of accounts. But the reality in the street is totally different. People see things differently, to be honest, to be clear. And they still committed to the boycott situation for a very simple reason: occupation of Palestinian land, settlement building in East Jerusalem, as well as in the West Bank, given that there is a consensus on the 1967 borders. This hegemonic attitude, colonial attitude towards the Palestinians, expelling, circulating, siege of Gaza, that situation, I mean, Israeli Jews are 6 million and Palestinians are 6 million. I mean, it's going to be very hard to maintain this status quo down the road, given the type of situation in Palestine. The wall, it's a sense of discrimination, marginalization, anger, no future, youth, unemployment, refugee camps. It's just not what Ramallah may look like, it's what the rest of Palestine also is experiencing, including Palestinians inside what became Israel in 1948, their territories, their lands, their internal refugees. So there are so many issues. So to run away and jump into the UAE is a smart move, but not extremely smart. It angers. There is a reaction. You see, you have to also look at this region in the context of that the Arab world is also aspiring for democracy, is aspiring for change. This is across the region, by the way. And a leader can make an agreement, but it's not necessarily what's reflected in the region. I understand UAE has a small population, but even in that small population, you will have other opinion totally different, and yet it cannot be aired due to the repressive situation. Now, when we say the Gulf, it's not anymore the 6 GCC countries that make the Gulf Cooperation Council. So yes, Israel on the one hand came to the UAE. It will be associated more, a bigger state, a strong state, one of the strongest states in the Middle East, one of the most powerful armies, yet dealing with a small state that has an ambitious project that is facing trouble as well in Libya or in Yemen, even in Egypt, even in other areas, and trouble in the crisis with Qatar, because that wasn't, it was a very, it had no logic to start with, and there were no bases for that crisis. But there could have been other motives as well, but it did not work. It failed totally. The siege of Qatar or the boycott of Qatar failed completely, given that Qatar continues, stands out. And yet Kuwait stands out on the other side. It has elections. They're not perfect, working on it. It's in a transitional stage right now, as it is discussing openly more issues of change, representation, redrawing of districts, maybe redrawing of the election. So Kuwait, because it has a more popularly based base, legitimacy is more popular, it is able to say this agreement does not stand. This agreement with the UAE should have been first with the Palestinians. And we've seen agreements with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, but we've also seen what happens in Jordan. Jordan is very afraid, feels not really stable with the agreement, feels that going around the Palestinian right means this destabilizing Jordan at some point. There are those in the Israeli scene that keeps repeating that Jordan is a Palestinian state, which means they have intention to destabilize. So in a way, many people do see the destabilizing aspect of the UAE Israel agreement, and they do see that while this happens, settlements continue. It's 1/3 of the Israeli budget goes to housing, goes 1/3 of it to settlements. There are always announcements on new projects, and that's Palestinian land. Not to say that all of Palestine is Palestinian land, and now it has become Israeli land, and Israel now dominates all of Palestine, and so that conflict will not go away. It will not go away. It will just only takes new shape, new aspects. It may be regulated, less violent, but the stories, the suffering, the marginalization, the agonies, the pains, the sense of exile is very suffocating for Palestinians and for many Arabs who feel their pain as well, no matter what certain autocrats may be telling the Israeli political system, left and right. That does not reflect. Nobody knew Mubarak is going to go suddenly. Nobody knew Gaddafi is going to disappear suddenly. Nobody knew that there will be such a rebellion in Syria. Nobody was able to foresee what will happen. Nobody knew that one day when Israel attacked Lebanon and entered into a package with Lebanon and an agreement with another group in Lebanon, it will end up with Hezbollah. And will end up with a much more radical group even than the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was a legitimate national liberation group movement seeking return, seeking its independence and national aspiration. No matter what means it used, like everybody else has used these means, it was also facing the Israeli means, which were far more superior, inflicted more pain and destruction all over the space. So really, we need to realize, I mean, I do understand in the early 90s, we've had a process. The process was a peace process, and there was a lot of hope. I don't see now, at this moment, the same hope. I saw the hope in the early 90s, honestly, that when Baker and when Bush put everybody together, and there was the Madrid conference, and then came Oslo, and many people had a sense of optimism regarding that. But then an Israeli prime minister was assassinated in 1995 by an extremist. And from there on, the trust fell down. And also the settlements really never radically, seriously stopped. But then they advanced and advanced and advanced into what the condition of today. Today, Israel is an apartheid state. Now, you may not like that, but it is an apartheid state. You look at this situation, even you look at United Nations resolutions in the last few years, you look at human rights organizations from Israeli human rights all the way to international human rights organizations. There is a sense we have entered an apartheid situation, and we have entered a situation where Palestinians are saying, well, you have suffocated the Palestinian state you first committed for, and you agreed to help happen, and it didn't happen, and it doesn't seem it's going to happen, and all the conditions now are taking us into an apartheid situation and a state of resistance to that apartheid. So how will this agreement hold when more demonstrations take place, when Palestinians unite their act? Maybe this is one positive act, actually the most positive of this agreement. It has given the Palestinians a big wake-up call. So if that helps, then yes, it has given them a wake-up call. As a result of that, Hamas and Fatah are speaking. As a result of that, all organizations are speaking. As a result of that, you can see a Palestinians taking more, they're recovering, at least I would say, recovering from the end of the second intifada, with all the pain that really happened as a result. You know, the second intifada was a big, it was a war between Israelis and Palestinians, but the pain and the assassinations and the net result was a big loss for the Palestinians. Most of the main middle cadre that participated in that intifada was murdered or killed or assassinated or in prison. And yet the Palestinians are now recovering out of that. And I think they will go back into putting their movement it doesn't necessarily at all mean going back to the military approach. It will still be peaceful. It will still be, but it has to reflect the real pain and the real aspiration and the real need. And it has to look for allies, maybe within Israel, within the Jewish community in the world, within wherever it can, in order to bring about a transformation. But what kind of transformation when this apartheid ends? Would it be one state or would it be two states? The struggle goes on, the stories go on as long as there is pain, there is refugees, there is suffering that has not stopped in terms of property, in terms of existence, in terms of, I mean, the Palestinians at the end of the day were the ones thrown into the sea, thrown into the desert, not the Israelis. They were never really at a threat. And I know there is a narrative in Israel that it was a threat. There was never a threat. Even in 1948, King Abdullah was speaking with them. Even in 1950s, Nasser was trying to speak with them. Even in the early 50s, late 40s, Hosni Zaim in Syria was trying to speak with them. Everybody was trying to speak. And I understand that from state to state relations, but the stories of people and agonies and suffering continues. And without addressing these issues, no peace will stand. And if it does, it is not a real peace, and it will only look a shadowy one that is up to a point. Look at 1994. In the early 90s, there were several offices, one in Qatar, one in the UAE, that really began a consulate for Israel, and there was this exchange. And what happened? There was the Gaza war, and slowly everybody stopped. So we are in a hard time. It's not an easy time for people. Yet, I will tell you, this region is going through transformation. The corona situation has complicated things much more. And as we get out of corona with the economies, with the mismanagement of leaders, and we may have a big change in the White House and some of those who carry this particular zeal to make these separate small deals at the expense of the real issues may not be around, and these policies may totally change. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Shafeeq. Thank you for confirming that Arab public opinion still regards this Palestinian issue as a very emotive issue, which also raises anger in the general public. But I have two questions really for the rest of. Sure. Thank you, Dr. Mahmoud. Let's hear from Rabbi David Rosen on his views on this as well, on these questions.
Thank you. Well, if you'd like to hear my response concerning the Palestinians, I think I'm the only one on the call who's actually living amongst the Palestinians. So I can tell you that despite the rhetoric generally of senior-aged intellectuals who will tell you that the Palestinian population is reflected by Abu Mazen and by Hamas in terms of the rejectionists, that is not the case at all on the street. I think the vast majority of Palestinians are just fed up with their leadership. Whether it's the PA, whether it's Abu Mazen, whether it's Hamas, they see them all as corrupt. Their infighting and incapacities to come together is what causes the distress. Most Palestinians feel that the Second Intifada failed them because it persuaded Israelis that there isn't a partner for peace, and therefore all the opportunities that were there were lost, and that they are ultimately the victims of their own leadership. In fact, I'm surprised at how many Palestinians see the UAE-Israel Accord in a positive light, and out of total frustration with their own leadership, are hopeful that influences from the Gulf might be able to improve their lot and the conditions of their life. There's a feeling amongst the Palestinian street that Abu Mazen's rejection of Olmert was a big mistake, that violence all the time only is counterproductive, and that Israelis are more, in fact, intransigent, which is the case, precisely as a reaction to this reaction. And proof of the fact is that 20% of Israeli society are Arab Muslims who have full citizen rights. And therefore, the idea of apartheid is rather a silly concept when you look at that reality in terms of what Israel is. But I would say that Palestinians are very frustrated with essentially traditional Arab policy, and are hopeful that there might be a new horizon here. And I'm hopeful that there might be a new horizon which will alleviate the Palestinian situation, because their present leadership is not capable of delivering that for them. And that's a great tragedy for them. I certainly believe a two-state solution is still feasible. But even if we come to a situation where we have some kind of cantonized structure, that would be the case. The vast majority of Israelis want a strong Jordan, they want a strong Egypt, they want neighbors which they can rely on. And the result of the Abraham Accord has given people some kind of optimism, and I think even amongst Palestinian society.
I mean, I will comment on the Rabbi's comment as well, if that is okay. Is that, I mean, the Rabbi lived in South Africa, knows what apartheid is, lived in Ireland, knows what conflict is, has a background, I think was born in the UK,
Good memory.
Right, and maybe you have activated the law of return to come back to what you consider your country, while a Palestinian who was born in Palestine and is in exile now cannot activate the law of return to go back to any part or section of Palestine, cannot even visit it. It's an irony. I mean, and I know you know the sufferings of others. I know you live, you talk, but it's very hard for you to be able to talk on behalf of the Palestinians in such a complex situation. I know there are Palestinians who are critical of the authority or critical of Hamas, but this is their leadership. It's like there are many Israelis who are critical of Netanyahu. He happens to be the leader of the Israelis at this point, right-wing, problematic. You may have a prime minister from the extreme right, which I think rising, several parties that today have that potential. Nobody will choose anybody's leader for them. Yes, Abu Mazen is legitimate for Palestinians, despite the difficulty. The economy is extremely difficult in the West Bank. It's totally Israeli controlled. It's totally export-import, normal life, the settlements. I mean, 60% of the land is not really under Palestinian control. You cannot build a viable situation. Yet Palestinians will build something, will manage. They exist. They will. Their nationalism is solid. And therefore, yes, many Palestinians will respect all the Arab countries, including the UAE, but it doesn't mean they agree with this agreement. They feel it's let them down. But at the same time, they realize that they're not happy with the division between Hamas and Fatah. So Hamas is there, Fatah is there. There'll be new ones coming, like in every situation. The young generations want to live in peace, but they want to live with justice, respect, dignity, aspirations. I mean, you can't be thrown from your home in East Jerusalem because you happen to be an Arab. You can't be a 20% of the population in proper Israel, the quote-unquote only democracy, but not really the only democracy. It's a democracy for an ethnic group. Judaism, Jews who have created an Israeli nationality. And I do see the Israeli nationality being created in the process. But what's the situation? You are a Muslim in a Zionist Jewish state that has the nationality law that tells you're not really, and that's problematic. One day this will have to change, and it will only happen when marginalized people raise their voice. Even in the USA, marginalized people are raising their voice regarding equality, discrimination, what happened in Minnesota in the beginning. I mean, that's in the USA, which has a much better, much more amazing, positive human rights record, relatively speaking, when you compare it with Israel. Israel doesn't have a positive human rights record, given the way it has treated the indigenous population over the years. And it's not true. Abu Mazen rejected. That's not true. There was never a real offer to the Palestinians along the lines of the June 4th borders, by which the Palestinians agreed after a long suffering and a long way to partition in that context. There was never a real a real offer. No, neither in Camp David with President Clinton, never. Read Bob Malley, read Hussein Agha, read other members who were there. You will see it was much more controversial, and it was always, you see, the US has always had a blind eye towards Israel. That has been a problem. And with this administration in particular, we have the lowest trust. I mean, there is not only a blind eye, it's all the eyes are blind. With Mr. Kushner and with the President Trump, it's a one-sided. And you cannot be a broker. You cannot even be an acceptable broker to produce peace when you are one-sided. It will not work. You can have a wishful thinking about it working, but it will not work. So we are in this. Palestinians genuinely want to see an end to the apartheid and forget the leadership. Let's talk about the base. Let's talk about Maslow's needs. Let's talk about human suffering. Let's talk about what people want. They want to travel. They want to live normal. They want to go and come. But they want political rights. They also want human civil rights. They want all their rights. They don't want their prisoners thrown for ages, strike after strike, 6,000 of them in Israeli jails. It's not today. There is no Israeli de Klerk. And you're telling me maybe there is no Palestinian Mandela, but I will tell you that President Abbas and even Hamas, you've been negotiating with Hamas all along between all these wars, between 2008 and 2014. There has been on these ceasefire. I mean, war is maybe negotiation in a different way, but at least people have been able to come to grips into the limits of militarism and military. And that's where you had in the Gaza Strip under siege, under human conditions that are, you are not estimating the time bomb in Gaza. You are not estimating the suffering of people in Gaza to the point where there are now 2 generations that are not even in a normal situation, under total siege, can travel, can go, can see the world, can manage. I mean, we're lucky there is the social media, but besides that, they are totally encircled. And yet,
thank you, Dr. Shafeeq.
I'm not here to debate the Palestinian issue with you. Obviously, I disagree with almost everything you've said. I was asked simply whether what the Palestinian attitude was. And I would tell you the Palestinian attitude is not that of Abu Mazen and of Hamas. And with regards to the suffering and the desire to resolution, the vast majority of Israelis would like to do that. They're suffering too. You completely ignore, therefore, the dimension of it. There's a situation to resolve, but it's not a question of apartheid. Apartheid is when you deny people their civil liberties on the basis of the color of their skin. Here, this is a security issue, where Israel is proven by the fact that its citizens have full rights regardless of race, color, creed, but the situation with regards to the West Bank and Gaza is totally different. Why? Why is it totally different from the situation with regards to the Arabs within Israeli society? Because it's not an apartheid issue. It's an issue to do with security and threat and perceptions of their own particular viability. So you can criticize Israel policy. You can say it's wrong, perfectly legitimate to do so. But it's not coming out of a desire to oppress people because of the color of the skin or their ethnicity or their religion. That's why the term is wrong.
Thank you. Thank you both. For the interest of time, let us go to...
I mean, Rabbi David, look into it. It's not about the color of the skin. We are colored in a certain way. We are third world. We are Muslims and Arabs and Christians in the Holy Land, and we've been treated in the way any colonial settler would treat people.
There are more Israeli blacks than there are Palestinians.
Read all the books, Israeli books. Read Tom Segev, even.
Okay, thank you both. I think we can agree to disagree for now. In the interest of time, we will move to Dr. Baboot's 10-minute just to add on to your earlier comment about the public opinion. I have with me sort of a summary of Middle East public opinion poll done by Dr. James Zogby, of the president of the Arab American Institute. And he conducted a poll in 2018 where about the feelings by citizens in Saudi Arabia and the UAE about the Palestinian issue. And it seems that roughly 60% of respondents in both countries said they oppose partnering with Israel against Iran, even if Israel ends the occupation and signs a peace deal with the Palestinians. So it's sort of a statistic that we have here. But let us now invite Rabbi David Rosen to give his 5 to 10 minutes remarks. Could you comment on the degree of cooperation in the Gulf with Jewish communities and how that plays into informal relations with Israel. Of course, we've seen how religious inclusiveness has been a theme. And one prime example is Pope Francis' landmark visit to the UAE, and following which the UAE's decision to establish an interfaith council known as the Higher Committee of Human Fraternity. So will we see this trend continuing, and how can interfaith relations spill over into more formal forms of diplomacy? We've also seen that Israel scored 2 diplomatic gains when majority Muslim Kosovo agreed to recognize Israel, and also we've seen how Serbia has said that it would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Both are US brokered deals, by the way, but just to get your views on these and your comments. Thank you.
I will indeed, but I think your comment immediately after Dr. Abdullah finished was important. You noted the survey that showed that regardless of whether Israel establishes a peace treaty with the Palestinians, there is still hostility and there's still opposition. So you have confirmed that with your data. Now that's really important because Dr. Abdullah's own particular view may be very noble and very positive, but I think he has a rather generous view of the Arab world as a whole. Between from December 2008 to 2001 to 2019, one of the most important hate monitoring organizations went to book fairs in Doha, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait City, Muscat, Jeddah, and Cairo. In every single one of these instances, they found numerous examples of anti-Semitic books through online platforms and apparently on site as well. They included Hitler's Mein Kampf, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the International Jew, and even copies of Mein Kampf and International Jew were listed in the catalogue under children's books. I mean, we can go on with this. It is absolutely naive at best to conclude that there is no anti-Semitism and hostility towards as Jews qua Jews within the Arab world and within the Gulf as a whole. Now, you could say, and I think that's a legitimate argument, that were it not to be for the political conflicts, this might have not erupted. And maybe 100 years ago it was different. Even then, I think that's deluding ourselves, because even though the condition of Jews was much better under Islam than it was under Christianity, Jews still had to know their place. And the perception of the Jew as devious, as suspicious, as somebody untrustworthy, all the negative stereotypes prevail. And I encounter it when I travel within the Arab Muslim world, and I travel extensively. Now, I think that the UAE-Israel Accord is really significant in terms of changing those perceptions. We will see more tourism, more cooperation. We will overcome those stereotypes and negative perceptions, and I believe that will redound also to Palestinians' advantage. But it's simply not true to say our only problem is with Israel and we love Jews. In fact, look at now Sudais of the mosque in Saudi Arabia, who it didn't even refer specifically to the Abraham Accord, but simply referred to some positive attitudes of the Prophet towards Jews. He received incredible vitriol and condemnation for preparing the way for some kind of reconciliation with Israel. And if you look online and you see what kind of language was used against him, let alone against Jews, it's what you would call anti-Semitic. So I think there is something far more serious that needs to be addressed than simply to pass it away and say, we love Jews, they're fine, it's only Israel we have a problem with. At any rate, now getting specifically to what you asked me to address, interfaith initiatives tend to come first and foremost from minorities who want to be understood and accepted by a majority. And sometimes you have within civil society, which is not widespread within the Arab world, and indeed not widespread perhaps throughout the whole of the world, but there are civil societies where people want to advocate for tolerance and for social cohesion, and therefore they will see interfaith relations as an important vehicle in order to advocate for that. But it requires a certain amount of self-confidence and curiosity, and this has not generally been forthcoming. The engagement with Jews on the part of Arab Muslim countries has been primarily within the framework of broader interfaith involvement in the wake of September the 11th, 2001. And the consequences of the emergence of Al-Qaeda and of radical extremism were of course very serious, first and foremost for the image of the Arab Muslim world, and a recognition that there was a need to be able to address this image problem. Of course, first and foremost, there had to be the question of counterterrorism, and these countries invested heavily in this. And you saw initiatives coming from the UAE, like the Hadaya program and others in terms of counterterrorism. But an understanding that there was a need to be able to reach out and interfaith for a few reasons. First of all, to deal with the image issue. Secondly of all, to be able to advance the leverage of soft power, recognizing not everything is in hard power. There was also a need to be able to find alliances with the West. There is this myth that Jews have some disproportionate influence, and therefore a good relationship with Jews can help that. But the relationship was not necessarily specifically bilateral. It was more within a broader interfaith initiative. And there you had this amazing move of the late King Abdullah bin Abdulaziz from Saudi Arabia in terms of this whole initiative for interfaith dialogue that he initiated in 2004, I think it was, that he began this particular direction. And the UAE came in a little bit later. It wasn't really till 2014 that they founded, with the leadership of Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayah, this Forum for the Promotion of Peace in Muslim Lands, and then their important Marrakesh Charter that in 2016 based upon the Charter of Mecca of the Prophet Muhammad, and then the Alliance of Virtue. There are now 3 different ministries in the UAE working in the interfaith scene, and this involves the Jewish community very significantly. Is the Jewish community a specific goal of these interfaith initiatives? It's certainly one of them. It's not the only goal, but it's certainly one of them. And there have been more and more Jewish involvement. There's many more rabbis, scholars participating in interfaith colloquia and meetings in the UAE. You may know that I, just before COVID broke out, I was the first rabbi and certainly the first Israeli to be invited by Saudi Arabia and to meet with King Salman, within the context of an interfaith framework. In other words, it's not specifically because I'm from Israel. It's, however, the fact that I am from Israel and that I am a rabbi does not disqualify me. That's a big change. And that is a reflection, as I say, of the factors I mentioned before, and of also a recognition and a desire, whether it was in Saudi Arabia at its own pace, but in the UAE at a much more rapid pace, that there is a need to change attitudes within the country. And even what I was referring to before about the rampant anti-Semitism as a result of the conflict over the last 100 years has to be addressed too. And that the more there is engagement with the Jews, the more positive this will impact internally on society. There's also recognition that anti-Semitism is the most dangerous label in terms of their global interests. And if they can be seen countries to have a positive attitude towards Jews, this will help their image as well. In other words, all these things come together. And I think, therefore, not for nothing was the accord called the Abraham Accord. There is a recognition that the interfaith relationship, and specifically the bilateral interfaith relationship, which will now flourish far more extensively, is really important in providing, if you like, again, the soft context and support for political and diplomatic initiatives. And I think we'll see an increasing use of this dimension under with, if you like, the kind of rubric of Back to the Future, images of the past, constructive relationships between the Muslim and Jewish and Christian world. In fact, when we had this meeting with King Salman, he said something very interesting. He said, Islam is an open, embracing, and tolerant religion. We in Saudi Arabia were forced by political circumstances to become more insular and isolationist. We are now finding our way back to our original ethos. That's quite fascinating. Whether you accept this historical analysis or not doesn't matter. What matters is that this is the line that is coming out, and it's the line that Mohammed bin Zayed is also pushing through these different operations. As I mentioned, the one through the Forum for Peace in Iran, through Abdullah bin Bayah, now the head of the Supreme Fatwa Council, the interfaith Action Council, which deals with combating hate and promoting child welfare in the digital age coming out of the UAE Ministry Interior, as well as a Ministry of Tolerance, which of course had the Year of Tolerance, and with regards to the papal visit and the establishing now of the House of Abraham, where they will be building for the first time, at least in recent memory, a new synagogue within the Arab Muslim world, together with a church and a mosque in Abu Dhabi. This, of course, is symbolic, but symbolism is very significant here. And that symbolism is essentially the constructive use of religion to create an atmosphere at which diplomatic understanding, collaboration, and cooperation is made more feasible.
Really peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Shafeeq, if you could unmute. Yeah.
Well, so many things have been said. I would definitely focus on that this agreement stands on the wrong leg, the wrong feet. It does not address any of the issues. Gulf countries are divided. The fact that some Gulf countries have agreed or looked at they are flexible is from too much US pressure. And I will warn that too much pressure on countries in the Arab world will backfire. And I guarantee you it will backfire at some point. It plays into the hands of Iran and Turkey as well. We have regional competitors who also speak about the question of Palestine. Both Turkey and Iran have a stake in that as well, given the situation as it evolved. I do understand that Israel once had a perfect relation with Turkey and a more perfect relation with Iran. And I see that today they don't have that. It's much less with Turkey, not like before, but it went to the opposite with Iran. And I remember when Israel was able to enter Lebanon, while many people in Lebanon then hoped that maybe the Israelis will rid them of the situation, particularly in South Lebanon. And I recall when the Israeli army entered, there were people who were maybe happy that this may end all wars and all situations. And how did the Israelis leave South Lebanon? With Hezbollah confronting them and liberating their land rightfully, like anybody liberating, like the French resistance liberated their land from Nazi occupation. So I want to tell you that the image of Israel in the region is that of a state that is a rouge state. It's a state that doesn't care about international law. It doesn't stand up in relation. It started with an original sin. You want to call this anti-Semitism? It is not. When you kick an entire nation, an entire population, that's anti-Arab, that's anti-Muslim, that's anti-native. It's not anti-Semitism. There is no anti-Semitism per se, unless we always talk about minorities have an issue always all over the world. I mean, you can say whites, anti-black, you can say Black Lives Matter, but you have created, according to Finkelstein, an industry called the Holocaust industry. So the Holocaust have happened. It's a disaster by all means in history. And, but to be able to use it regularly in order to settle land that is not yours, to take rights that is not yours, to persecute people that you should not persecute, in order to force yourself on an entire land, regardless of any human value, that's what when I call apartheid and when I say occupation. And when I look at it and say, this explodes, this status quo cannot continue and will not continue given the situation. So yes, the image of Israel in the Arab world is tarnished. It's a negative one. And it has linked itself to a certain image regarding people, people will generalize. And I can see that, but at the same time, it's not anti-Judaism. That's not correct. But people have a very low opinion of the Israeli state because it started with an original sin. It never recognized that original sin. It never apologized. It never said yes for a law of return, partial, full, regulated, and agreed upon. It never agreed to a genuine Palestinian state. It weakened the Palestinian leadership that came with Arafat and then with Abu Mazen. As flexible as Abu Mazen is, it weakened, it pushed the Palestinians to create Hamas. Hamas did not come out of a vacuum. It came out of realities of suffering, and it pushed Palestinians to create Hamas as much as it pushed Lebanese to create Hezbollah. I mean, so basically we're in a quagmire. That's not true. We're not, it's a very superficial to say things are okay. They are not okay because also we are in a region that when you mix with a certain category of autocrats, you will hear whatever they think. Does that reflect the reality? Yes, you've had a poll, but there is a poll by the Washington Institute here in Washington, D.C., which gives a solid, a different opinion, though it's the Washington Institute. It's more pro-Israel, and yet it was able to see that there is a big sizable proportion of the population, 70 and 80%, that has a negative view of this agreement and of the way Israel handles itself. So people are fed up with settlements, people are fed up with occupation, people are fed up with expansion, people are fed up with trying to destabilize Jordan, people are fed up and they feel Israel will try to destabilize the Gulf and will bring militarization of the Gulf with a small state that has a project 10 times its size. And it's going to be very hard to keep, to hold, to maintain.